Welcome back. We're into chapter 33 now, which is all about animal nutrition and how things get processed through the body. And we are going to be skipping section 3, which is really the pathway of food through the body, but you are going to be covering that in lab, so that information will be covered at some point for you in this semester. So the term nutrition basically means you take food in, the food that's taken in is torn apart, and then it's absorbed. So taken in, taken apart, and taken up is the process of animal nutrition. And I would know the different types of categories that animals can be. Herbivores would be those that eat mainly plants and algae. So if you're vegan or a vegetarian, you're technically an herbivore. Carnivores are those that eat other animals, eat meat. Omnivores, that should be an O right there, but omnivores regularly consume animals as well as plants and algae. So most people are considered omnivores. And most animals are opportunistic feeders, meaning that they feed on things as they arise. They come across food and they feed on it as the opportunity arises, as opposed to a lion probably isn't so opportunistic as they go out to hunt for their food and find it. So section 33.1 talks about an animal's diet and some of the organic building blocks and essential nutrients that are important and necessary for your diet. So when you consume food as an animal, you are getting chemical energy from that food, which is then converted into ATP. And remember from Biology 1406, ATP is a chemical substance that powers all of the processes in the cells that make your body do what it needs to do. Organic building blocks such as organic carbon and nitrogen are provided by your diet to synthesize a variety of organic molecules. So if you're not consuming food, you're not able to repair muscle or do work inside of your body, not only because you're not getting enough ATP from the food to do your cellular processes, but you're also not getting the building blocks to make other molecules inside of your body. We are getting essential nutrients from our diet, and these are things that are required by our cells that you have to get from dietary sources. So there are 4 different classes of essential nutrients, and you have probably recognized and will recognize 2 of these terms. There are essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, and then vitamins and minerals. And so a well-balanced diet should give you all those things that you need, but I think we all realize that we eat a lot of processed food and foods that may not give us those essential nutrients, which is why we take our vitamins or do different supplements to our diet. So we've got 20 amino acids that we have to have that and that can synthesize about half from the molecules in your diet. So animals require 20 amino acids, and we can make about half of the molecules from your diet. The remaining amino acids are essential amino acids, and we have to eat that in order to get it into our body. In animals, fatty acids are converted into a variety of cellular components. We are using these fatty acids for the phospholipids in your membrane, to do signaling molecules, and for fat storage. So it is important to have fat as part of your diet, and the fatty acids are what's so important for us. So we can't make fatty acids, but plants can make their own fatty acids. Instead, we have to obtain that from different things in our diet, and usually that is something that most animals are able to obtain as opposed to having to supplement that. Vitamins are considered organic molecules that are required in our diet in small amounts. If you eat too much of a certain vitamin, there are other problems that can arise from that. So most vitamins we obtain in small amounts. 13 vitamins are essential for humans, and they are grouped into 2 categories: fat soluble and water soluble. Fat soluble meaning it can get dissolved and incorporated into your fat bodies. Water soluble, it cannot. And then minerals are inorganic nutrients. So vitamins were organic, minerals are inorganic, meaning that they have no carbon in that molecule. And these are also usually required in small amounts, and ingesting large amounts of some minerals can significantly impair health, such as too much iron like if you look at vitamins for children's vitamins generally don't have iron in them because they can't ingest large amounts of that. So there are dietary deficiencies that we can have. Probably the most common one is malnourishment. Malnourishment is different from undernourishment. Malnourishment is when we have a long-term absence in our diet of one or more essential nutrients. So think about this. It is possible to be obese but malnourished because you're not eating the proper well-balanced diet that you should be consuming. Deficiencies in essential nutrients can cause deformities, they can cause disease, they can cause death. You can go and Google goiter, and you can see where people who have a deficiency of salt in their diet will experience what looks to be a very uncomfortable and very causes some deformities in their appearance as well. So a lot of animals will actually consume salts and minerals to obtain missing nutrients, and they might do this from licking a salty piece of rock. If you have livestock, then you put salt out or mineral blocks out so that they can consume that. A diet with insufficient amounts of one or more amino acids is the most common type of malnutrition among humans, and I would venture to say, I am no nutritionist, but I would venture to say that probably more than half of our population is malnourished in some way. Even if you appear healthy and look healthy, you can still be malnourished. Individuals subsisting on simple rice diets are often very deficient in vitamin A. So in Asian cultures where they're eating mainly rice, there's not a lot of protein or other grains to get the different minerals and vitamins. They can be incredibly deficient in vitamin A especially. And scientists and science is a wonderful thing because they've been able to engineer a strain of rice that is converted into vitamin A after they consume it. So it's like a superfood in a way. If it's grown and if they consume it, then they're able to overcome that deficiency that's very common. Malnutrition is different. Malnutrition, can arise when a diet doesn't provide enough chemical energy. So malnutrition is different than undernourishment. An undernourished person will use up all your fat stores and carbohydrates. So think of a severely anorexic person who is incredibly thin. Think of, someone who's literally starving. So think of prisoners in other countries who aren't fed very well. Very skeletal in appearance. There's no fat stores in their face. Incredibly thin, just skin and bones, literally. They will, and one of the reasons why they're just skin and bones is because their body will start to break down its own proteins. So you lose the ability to grow thick and full hair. Your body starts to eat its own muscle mass, and so you lose muscle. And that's why when you see pictures of individuals from like concentration camps, there's no muscle on their body. If you were to compare it to pictures of them before they were undernourished, they would have more muscle mass on their body. These people also will suffer protein deficiency of the brain. When you think about when you get hangry or you get really tired because you're hungry and you just can't think straight, this is, to another extreme. And that they can die or it can cause irreversible damage because the proteins around certain organs aren't working properly and you start to have organ failure. In section 2, we're going to be talking about food processing in ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. So the processing of food is 4 distinct stages. We ingest it, our bellies digest it, our bodies absorb it, because now it's been broken down, our bodies absorb it and it gets used in our body the way it needs to be. And then we have to get rid of the waste, and that would be elimination. Ingestion is the act of eating or feeding. Makes a lot of sense, right? And there's different strategies for this among different animals. Digestion is the process of breaking down food into small molecules that are small enough to absorb. So when you eat macromolecules, or when you eat very complex sugars as opposed to simple sugars, when you eat fats, proteins, your body has to spend a lot of time breaking it down so there's more energy for it to absorb. When it's a simple sugar, it gets broken down really quickly and your body absorbs it right away. And so you have this burst of energy and then usually a fall. But by eating complex foods, things higher in protein, complex carbs, fibrous things, you're able to sustain yourself off of that food a little bit longer. There's more energy available in that food. So initially, we have mechanical digestion. We chew our food, and that increases the surface area of the food. We smash it all up and we swallow it. Chemical digestion splits the food further into smaller molecules that can pass through membranes. And this is going to happen in your stomach with all that stomach acid, right? In chemical digestion, the process of enzymatic hydrolysis splits bonds and molecules with the addition of water. So when you get really sick and you throw up the next day, you notice there's a lot of liquid that's in that, right? Because it's been broken down, you've had some water, your body has moisture in it, and it's not just a whole chunk of a hamburger, it's a mix of things that you're spitting back up again because of that chemical digestion process and all the enzymes in your stomach. After or while sometimes it's in your stomach, you start to absorb. Your body absorbs the nutrients into your cells. And then finally, we have to eliminate the waste because not everything we consume is used. You know very well that we have an elimination of that waste and it leaves the digestive system. Most animals process food in specialized compartments, and these compartments reduce the risk of the animal digesting its own cells and tissues. So you have a lot of mucus that is inside of your stomach. You have special cells. It's a special compartment so that those enzymes don't eat a hole in the stomach. When you don't have the right balance, that's when you get an ulcer and you do start to eat away at that lining. In intracellular digestion, so inside of the cell, food particles are engulfed by something called phagocytosis. So it reaches out and it grabs the food. So inside of your cell, food has come in. Inside of there, they still have to digest it a little bit further. Food vacuoles containing food will fuse with lysosomes. Remember that are kind of like the garbage disposals. They break things down, and those lysosomes contain hydrolytic enzymes. And so it's almost a stomach within a stomach. It's a stomach within an individual cell. Extracellular digestion, so outside the cells, is the breakdown of food particles outside of the cells. It occurs in compartments that are continuous with the outside of the animal's body, and animals with simple body plans have a gastrovascular cavity that functions in both digestion and distribution of nutrients. So there are different types of gastrovascular cavities that different animals have. More complex animals are going to have what seems to be a more complex digestive tract and gastrovascular cavity. In this example of a hydra, which is closely related to like a jellyfish, they have a little tiny mouth, right? And they have tentacles that will reach out, sting, and bring in food. And the food goes in through the mouth, and in that gastrovascular cavity, they have digestive enzymes that get released from the cells. It breaks the food down, and then it gets reabsorbed into the body. More complex animals have a complete digestive tract or an alimentary canal. And the alimentary canal is kind of like a tube within a tube, right? It's mouth to anus, kind of a tube within your body, which could be considered a tube as well. And then, there's special regions inside of your digestive tract that carry out absorption and digestion in a very stepwise fashion. And there's lots of different types of alimentary canals. There are those in earthworms, which are very simple. Food goes in the mouth. The pharynx kind of smushes it up. So does the esophagus. The crop holds it. The gizzard really grinds it up. And then they have a simple intestine and it's out through the anus. In insects, it's a little bit more complex because they're a more complex animal. In through the mouth, they do have a crop. They have something called gastric ceca, which produce enzymes to help break that food down. And they actually have their gut is separated into the fore, mid, and the hindgut. They have a rectum, which is able to squeeze all the rest of the moisture, extra moisture out of the food, and then it comes out the anus. And then in a more complex organism that is a vertebrate like a bird or us, or other mammals, mouth, esophagus. Birds have a crop, we don't. They have a stomach. They have a gizzard that grinds it down even more, an intestine tract that usually is where absorption takes place, and then the anus. And we have a variation of that also. We don't have a gizzard, we don't have a crop. And we have more of a we have more of an intestinal tract. So digestive systems of vertebrates are incredibly varied, with many adaptations linked to the animal's diet. So one of those adaptations is your teeth. And if you think about the way your teeth look versus the way a dog's teeth looks versus the way even a cat's teeth looks, very, very different depending on what kind of diet they have. The success of mammals is due in part to their dental adaptations, which is very specialized for those diets. And non-mammalian vertebrates have less specialized teeth. Though exceptions do exist. So like one example is the poisonous teeth of snakes that are modified into fangs, and not all snakes necessarily have fangs. But the teeth of a lot of fish, saltwater fish, and maybe some freshwater fish are very similar. There's not a lot of dental adaptations. There's not more molars, no front, like you might see in a cow versus large canines and, different adaptations. So here's some different pictures. And you can look at the skull of animals to determine if they're a carnivore, herbivore, or an omnivore. And so carnivores are going to have large incisors and canines that can rip that flesh, and they are going to have molars in the back to be able to shred and crush the food. Herbivores are usually have very small or no canines and incisors, and instead they have larger or more molars so they can grind up that food because they don't need to rip it. They just need to chew, chew, chew. And then omnivores would be an example of, as humans, where we have a combination of different, somewhere in between the carnivore and the herbivore, able to feed on meat, but also to grind down vegetables. And also many carnivores have really large expandable stomachs. If you think about how much food you eat on Thanksgiving, your stomach expands pretty darn well, right? An adaptation is apparent in the length of the digestive tract in a lot of different vertebrates. And herbivores and omnivores generally have longer alimentary canals than carnivores because they need a longer time to digest that vegetation. It doesn't break down as quickly. It's a little bit more complex. It needs a lot of enzymes to help it kind of break down inside the body. So looking at these two, you can see the cecum, which is used for absorption, kind of a storage place before it goes off into the intestines. But you can see there's definitely different intestinal tracts looking at a lion versus a koala. Lions, of course, being carnivores, strictly carnivores, and koalas being strictly herbivores. We also have mutual adaptations in our gut, and it's not just with humans, but many, many other animals have this mutualistic adaptation. And this is where you have bacteria that live in your digestive tract that are good bacteria. The balance can get off and it can become harmful to you, but for the most part, if you were to swab what's inside your intestinal tract, you would find that you have 10 to 100 trillion different species of bacteria living in there, or 10 to 100 trillion individual bacteria in there. Some intestinal bacteria produce vitamins, so it's mutualistic in that they have a house and a place to live inside your gut and they're giving you vitamins. And others might regulate development of the intestinal epithelium, which is the cells in the intestine, and may function in the innate immune system. So they might have effects on your immune system, helping it out, helping produce cells when you need cells, or providing vitamins. A microbiome is a collection of these microorganisms living in and on your body along with their genetic material. So we have microbiomes in our stomach. We actually have microbiomes on our body as well. We have these mutualistic relationships with bacteria. We think of bacteria as being a terrible bad thing, but there are some bacteria that are necessary for us to be healthy. So researchers have found more than 400 bacterial sequences in the human digestive tract, which means there's, or bacterial species, so we have a lot living inside of us. And there are significant difference in the microbiome that's associated with diet, disease, and age. There's H. pylori, which disrupts stomach health and it will lead to ulcers. So that's a bad bacteria that shouldn't be allowed to get too numerous. But you can see that in your different stages of life, because you're feeding and you're eating different things, you will have different types of bacteria in higher numbers. which I think is pretty interesting. Even in what you would consider elderly, 65 to 80 is different than if you're over 100 years old. Many vertebrates host mutualistic bacteria and protists in fermentation chambers in their alimentary canals, and these microorganisms can digest cellulose in simple sugars and other compounds. And so one of the most well-known quintessential adaptations for this and examples of this is the herbivore diet in ruminants. So these are cud-chewing animals like cattle, or cows are probably the one that you think of the most, but also deer and sheep. And they have bacteria in their gut that help them break down cellulose that they couldn't break down otherwise. Just protists and microorganisms that are living inside there and are necessary for them to be able to obtain the food. So the protists break it down, or the microbes break down the food, and then the body now can absorb it. There's also a feedback circuit that regulates digestion and energy allocation, and also our appetite. So if you can recall from earlier concepts in 1406, positive and negative feedbacks, we see this also in consumption of food, regulation of digestion. An animal's intake of food and use of nutrients are matched to the circumstance and the need. So each step in the digestive system is activated as it's needed. So you're not shoving out tons and tons of hydrochloric enzymes if you don't need them. If your stomach is empty, that would be very harmful. The enteric division of the nervous system helps to regulate these digestive processes. So our nervous system is what tells one part to turn off and one part to turn on. And our endocrine system also regulates digestion by releasing and moving around hormones. And probably one of the most popular or most well-known hormones that we'll talk about in just a second is insulin. The flow and transformation of energy in an animal is called its bioenergetics, and its bioenergetics determine the nutritional needs. The energy that an animal uses per unit of time, whatever that unit of time might be, is called your metabolic rate. So some people have a higher metabolic rate than others do. Some animals inherently have a higher metabolic rate than others may. And you can determine metabolic rate by monitoring the rate of heat loss, the amount of oxygen consumed, and the amount of CO2 produced. Not really something that you can figure out on your own at home, but it is something that scientists can determine. And this is just a good schematic of kind of the overview of the bioenergetics, showing with the green arrows pointing down, food coming in, food getting digested and absorbed. We give off heat. And that's kind of, energy that's showing that we are producing energy. We give it off as heat. We lose energy in fecal material. We lose energy in nitrogenous waste, as in urine. Cellular respiration occurs after all the nutrients in the body cells are taking them up, and so we lose more heat. But this is kind of an idea of how energy is transferred. It's a lot of potential energy in that hamburger, and this is all the actual energy that's happening, kinetic energy. Animals have to maintain a minimum metabolic rate for basic cells to function. So when your metabolic rate is too low, you are not living. You're starting to die. And the minimum metabolic rate for basic cell function is called the basal, so baseline. Think of that metabolic rate, or the BMR, and that's the rate of a non-growing endotherm when it's at rest, has an empty stomach, and is experiencing zero stress. The metabolic rate of a fasting, non-stressed ectotherm at a particular temperature is called the standard metabolic rate, or SMR. So an endotherm is something that produces its heat from its body. We are endotherms. An ectotherm is like a amphibian or a reptile or insects that maintain heat from their environment. So they have different behavioral tactics where they might find the sun to rest. So you see a lizard sunning itself. It's trying to produce energy that way. So SMR is for the ectotherms and BMR is for us endotherms. Endothermy is more energetically costly than ectothermy because you're producing your own. You're using energy to make heat, right? For ectotherms and endotherms, activity greatly affects your metabolic rate because for endotherms, especially because the more you move, the more heat you're able to generate in your body. When an animal takes in more energy than it's needed for metabolism and activity, that energy is stored. So you eat more than you're burning off, and so that energy starts to get stored. In humans, the liver and the muscle cells are used first, and energy is stored as glycogen. When glycogen depots are totally full, that excess energy is then stored as fat. So you eat more than you can burn off, than your body needs, and you start to gain weight. You start to get bigger fat cells and more fat cells, or larger fat cells, and so you get fat. When fewer calories are taken in than expended, the body expends liver glycogen, muscle glycogen, and then finally fat. So if you're wondering, it's been a week and I've been on a diet and I know I've been burning more calories than I've been taking in, well, you've got to get rid of the liver and the muscle energy that's stored there, and then it will start using up fat energy. Insulin and glucagon are work together to maintain your glucose levels. So insulin's a hormone and when the levels rise after you have a carb-rich meal, so you just have a pasta dinner, insulin levels will rise, and glucose enters the liver and is used to start to make glycogen. When glucose concentration becomes low, then glucagon makes the liver break down glycogen and release glucose into the blood. So both insulin and glucagon are produced in the pancreas and beta cells and alpha cells. There are some videos, if you go into student links or in the mastering, under your student links, there is like study material. If you click on that and choose the chapter, there are some really good videos that explain this a little bit further. And here is one of those that I'm going to sit here and let you listen to.
The sugary snack you devour enters your digestive system and is broken down to simple sugars like glucose. Glucose enters the bloodstream, causing an increase in blood glucose levels. But various mechanisms bring blood glucose back down to its normal level, the set point. This is an example of homeostasis, the body's tendency to maintain relatively constant internal conditions. Hormones produced by the pancreas regulate blood glucose levels. Let's zoom in. When blood glucose levels are high, glucose molecules leave the blood and enter beta cells in the pancreas. The beta cells respond by releasing the hormone insulin. Insulin enters the bloodstream and is transported to cells all over the body. Let's see what happens in the liver. Insulin binds to receptors on liver cells. This causes the cells to take in more glucose. Inside the liver cells, glucose is converted to glycogen, a storage molecule. Blood glucose levels decrease as glucose is taken up by liver cells and other body cells. As a result, less and less insulin is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. This is an example of how negative feedback maintains homeostasis. What happens if you've skipped lunch and your blood glucose levels are low? Let's zoom into the pancreas again. When blood glucose levels are low, alpha cells in the pancreas release the hormone glucagon. Glucagon enters the bloodstream and acts on target cells in the liver. Glucagon binds to receptors on the liver cells, signaling the liver cells to break glycogen down to glucose. glucose is released. And blood glucose levels increase. As a result, less glucagon is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. In this way, two hormones with opposing effects allow the body to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In diabetes, the body is unable to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In type 1 diabetes, the beta cells of the pancreas are destroyed by the immune system, and so no insulin is produced. In type 2 diabetes, the pancreas produces insulin, but target cells do not take up glucose. In both types of diabetes, when blood glucose levels rise, cells do not take up the additional glucose, and so blood glucose remains high. This example shows the importance of homeostasis in everyone's life.
So the term diabetes, this book is for people from, and all over the United States, but for most of us living in Texas, in San Antonio, South Central Texas, the term diabetes is something that's very, very common for us to hear. It's a disease that we all probably know at least one person that has it. So diabetes is a disease caused by a deficiency of insulin or a decreased response to insulin in target tissue. And as a result, the cells cannot take up glucose to meet the metabolic needs. And so fat becomes the main substrate for cellular respiration. Type 1, there are two types of diabetes. Type 1 is an autoimmune disorder, often called juvenile diabetes, but it's not something that people will outgrow. And this is where the immune system will destroy pancreatic beta cells. Type 2 diabetes is failure of target cells to respond normally to insulin, and it is oftentimes hereditary, and it is oftentimes brought on by excessive body weight, lack of exercise. Someone who is obese and does not exercise has a much greater risk of being pre-diabetic or diabetic with type 2 diabetes than someone who is more active. Overnourishment causes obesity. That's where you eat more than you can burn off, and so that excess food becomes stored in your fat. And obesity contributes to type 2 diabetes, but it also contributes to a number of different things. It contributes to cancer, colon and breast cancer, heart attacks, strokes, a number of different diseases. So being overweight or obese is not a healthy thing. Researchers have discovered several of the mechanisms that help regulate body weight, yet there's still not that pill that you can take to fix it and not have to do the work by cutting back on the intake of calories or increasing the burning of calories that you do. Ghrelin is a hormone secreted by the stomach wall that triggers the feeling of hunger before your meals. So oftentimes you may not necessarily be hungry, but your body is used to, and so it will release this hormone to tell you it's time to eat. Insulin and PYY are both hormones that are secreted by the small intestines after you eat, and it suppresses the appetite. And then leptin is a hormone produced by your adipose or your fat tissue, which also suppresses your appetite and may regulate fat levels. So these are some of the mechanisms that help your body regulate body weight by releasing things. It's time to eat. Okay, now I'm full. I don't need to eat anymore. But our brain is more powerful. Our desire is more powerful sometimes than what our body's telling us. And so even though your body is producing insulin and PYY or leptin, then you may not stop eating after you are actually satiated. So that concludes chapter 33. Be sure to check on OneDrive to be able to download the notes if you want those. And don't forget to do your homework, the quiz, and then before the exam, the dynamic study module for this exam to help you, for this chapter to help you study for the exam.